Good morning, everyone. Zog the Gemara. Mem Hamad Aleph. Amar of Yehuda Amar Rav. Nikva Knafa Mitztarfin Leruba. We're talking about the trachea. We're talking about the puncture in the trachea. So it says that if the trachea is punctured like a sieve, so Lamaisa Mitztarfin Leruba. So the holes will combine to compose a majority of the circumference. So if you look at the picture, if you have the pictures, if you don't have it, you can share. But if you look at the picture, so the trachea, we're talking about severing the trachea across, and you have a bunch of holes there. So if you have a bunch of little holes over here, so the question is, if there's enough of holes that if you would line them up together, they would form rove of the circumference. It would be ki'ilu rove of the circumference was cut, and then it's going to be a problem. So right now we're not talking about an actual making the equivalent of a hole in the trachea. We're talking about the equivalent of like cutting a very small cut, but in rove of the circumference. Says Gemara, Masra b'Yirmiyah uvegogola sheyesh ba nekev echad arach, by a skull that has one long hole, afilu yesh ba nekavim harbe, if it has many small holes, mitztarfim l'melo makdeach, they combine for the size of a hole that was made by a drill, and that's what term antar. But what do you see? Alma kevin de shiura melo mikadeach. Once you have a measure with the size of a hole with a drill, limlo makdeach mitztarfin. Then when you have many small holes, they go to the size of the hole of the drill. Hachanami kevin de shiura keiser lecheisar mitztarfin. It's very interesting. What the Gemara seems to be saying is that you have two ways to trafe this up. Two ways to make this a trafer, right? You could either say, well, you have to cut it across rove of the circumference, or you could say you have to actually puncture it, a hole that's big enough to make a problem. So why are you assuming that all of these little holes over here, why are you assuming that all these little holes are mitztaref only to go ahead and make rove of the circumference? Why don't we say that all of these little holes are mitztaref to what? To be together to make a little hole in the actual trachea itself, right? There's a difference between if you would have a cut, so you'd have like a very slim cut, but along the rove of the circumference, or you can have just a big hole in the trachea. So why are we combining all these holes only if they're going to make a rove of the circumference? Why are we not combining them to actually make a hole the size of an isser in the trachea? Says the Gemara, there's two different types of holes, in case you didn't realize. Ishtamitite, he forgot. It slipped Rabbi Yirmiyah's mind when he asked the question. Hada amar Rebbe, Chelbo amar Rav Chama bar Guri amar Rab, nekam sheish ben chisaron mitztarfin leche isser, v'shein ben chisaron mitztarfin leruba. Which are worse? Ones that have a chisaron. What does that mean? There's two types of holes. You can either have a hole which goes all the way through the trachea, which includes the skin, a deficiency in the skin, so that if you have a bunch of holes next to each other, you're going to combine all those holes, which are through all the way through the trachea. You can combine all those holes in order to make what? In order to make it the size of an isar, which again is a certain type of coin, a small coin. So you go ahead, like we have by Hilchos Nida, right? You have the size of a penny, let's say. So if you have all these little holes that actually go through the skin, those holes are going to be more machmer. You're going to combine them to make a little hole the size of an ishar. And if you have that, then you're going to trafe it up based on the fact that there's a puncture in the trachea. But at the end of the day, if you don't have the holes that have real holes in them, if they're not missing the skin, that's she'ein ben chisaron, then it's only mitztarfin leruba. Then if they're just little punctures without going the skin actually missing, then it's only going to be a problem if they together are able to form sort of like a cut. If you would combine them, you would sort of find a cut that would take up most of the circumference. Again, what's happening? You're opening up the animal and you're finding these holes on the trachea. So you'd have to figure out, are these holes missing skin? If they're missing skin, then you have to measure all the holes. There's a whole discussion. Do you measure the skin in between the holes? Again, similar to Hilchos Nida. Do you measure the stuff in between the blood or not? So do you measure the stuff in between the holes? Either way, you're measuring all the holes and you're combining them to make an isar. If there's no skin missing, then you're not measuring them to combine to make an isar. You're measuring them to see if there's enough of them to go around the circumference or rove of the circumference of the trachea, as if you would have slit rove of the circumference of the trachea, and then it's aser. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Nitla heimena ritzua mitztarefes lecha iser. Now you don't have holes. Now you have a piece of skin that's very narrow that was removed. So again, if skin is removed, then we're not dealing with the measurement of a circumference of the thing, of a slit, then you'd actually have the size of an isser. So what happened here? Instead of little holes, you have an entire piece of skin that was removed. So how do you do that? Says the Gemara, it has to do with licha isser, that it has to do with, what's the chiddush here, is that you go based on the area. Right? You might have thought you have little dots, so you just measure, do all the little dots add up to a circle. Saying even if it's a long, narrow strip, you still are taking you're taking the entire area of the strip, and you're seeing if the entire area would add up to the equivalent of an isser, even though one is straight and one of them is round. Okay. If the trachea was punctured like a sieve, what's the halacha? We just had this. Amarlei, Haray Amru, exactly like we just said. If there's actually missing skin in the holes, then we're going to be more machmir. We're going to combine them for an isser. If they're not missing skin, but then you have to have more, and it's only if they add up to a majority of the circumference of the trachea. Very interesting. So what about by an oaf? Well, what's the question by an oaf? We know that, again, it becomes an isser if it's missing the skin. If it's not missing the skin, then there's nothing to talk about. If it's not missing the skin and it's just holes, so then on an oaf as well, it's going to be the rove of the trachea. If the holes add up without missing skin to the rove of the trachea, the equivalent, it would be a problem. But if you're telling me that holes in an animal, literal holes with the skin missing, so you have to have enough holes to combine to make an isser, well, if that's the amount that's going to puncture, for instance, a trachea of an animal, the animal is a lot bigger than an oaf. So if the isser is going to be a hole that's going to be a puncture in the trachea that's going to postle or trafe up the animal, then seemingly there'll be a smaller size that's going to go ahead and it's going to trafe up a bird. So what's that size where you have holes again that are missing skin? If they're not missing skin, then you're going to do rove, and just like you do rove of an animal, which is going to be a lot more, you'd have to do rove of the oaf's trachea, which will be a lot less. But if you have holes with skin missing, and you're going to combine them to make an isser to see whether there is enough of an isser to consider it to be a puncture, then the question becomes, how do you deal with that when you're dealing with an oaf, which is smaller? So what do you do? So this is a little bit complicated, but if you look at the note over there, so you're going to cut around the place where the holes are, again, the holes that are not missing skin, you're going to cut around to form a flap, and you're going to fold the flap al pi akana over the mouth of the trachea. If it covers the majority of the mouth, it's going to be a trachea. It's going to be a trachea. It's going to be a treifa. If it covers the majority of the mouth of the trachea, it's going to be a treifa. V'imlav, and if not, it's going to be kasher. Amar Papa v'simanacha nafia. It's like a nafia. So what is this? So if you look over here at the illustration, you have these holes over here on top. We're trying to figure out, are these holes big enough? Well, we said, well, if you're dealing, these are holes that are missing skin. So if you're dealing with an animal, you just check if they're an isser worth. How do you check over here? So again, I'm not sure why it doesn't give a smaller coin. Maybe there wasn't a smaller coin. So how does it tell you to do it? The Gemara says what you're going to do is you're going to cut it like this. Again, it's already dead, the animal. You're just checking it out. So you're going to cut it out on 3 sides, and you're going to form a flap, and you're going to bend the flap over the hole that you just made with the trachea. If that flap covers the majority of the hole, then it's going to be a problem. If it doesn't, then the holes are not a big enough piece. Again, the holes are still together because it's holes that have skin in between them. So if there's going to be a majority of the flap of the trachea, of the hole of the trachea covered, then it's going to be, it sounds like a little bit of, I don't say random, it sounds like a little bit of a random measurement, but that's how you'd measure by an oaf.
You have a perforation, the hole, and it's missing the skin where the hole is, as opposed to missing skin. I don't understand what the difference is.
No, sorry. We're talking about a hole that's literally going through where the skin is mamish missing, as opposed to a hole where the skin is there, it sounds like. It's just, there's a hole there. Right? If I make a hole, I could still have my skin attached with a hole.
As a flap.
Well, the flap is just a way to measurement, but I'm talking about the actual holes that are on the trachea. You could actually have holes that are much deeper, where the skin is mamish removed. It's like you have literally a tiny hole. It's like sticking a pin in the trachea. Now there's a hole you could literally, if you could theoretically shine light, you'd be able to see it, as opposed to a hole which you couldn't shine light through because the skin is still there. Even though there's a hole in the skin is still there.
That's the part I don't understand. How do you have a hole without the skin?
Exactly. How is it a hole if you can't shine light through it anymore?
Again, you could have a hole without skin missing. You can make a hole and then the skin can sort of like cover it up again, right? You could either have a hole where the skin is removed, or you could have a hole where it just sort of like stretches a little bit, but it's still there.
You know, it's not like a cloth. If you make a hole, you're not really making a hole through it. You're going through the threads. You go to the skin, it's continuous. You make a hole, and it's got a space where that hole is. Otherwise, it's not a hole.
So again, if you want to make it, again, I'm trying to understand it as much as you are, but in terms of if you want to oversimplify it, it sounds like one of them is a hole that literally goes through the entire trachea, which is not that thick. The other one is a hole that doesn't puncture the entire trachea, it punctures some of the trachea.
Oh, okay.
So if you don't go through the entire trachea, it's not a complete hole. If you don't go through the entire trachea, then you're talking about a hole that's sort of a hole, but not a whole hole, and then
I'll tell
half a hole.
you're rubbing off on me.
They translate it here.
Yeah.
They're assuming it's the size of the hole.
Again, right. So I didn't understand. It doesn't sound like that to me. But
it says perforations that are deficiency, holes of a significant area.
yeah, it could be. It could be. That's not the way I understood it.
As small as a sieve.
It could be. That's not the way I understood, but it could be. So now the Gemara says again. Now you have now you have a different thing. So that was how you measured. So the way you would measure again holes that are not all the way through. Again, if they're not all the way through, then you have to just check it if there are enough of them to go around the circumference. If they're all the way through, like we're discussing, then by an animal it would be the size of an isar, and by a bird you'd have to actually cut it around, make the flap, and then fold the flap over and see if it covers rove of the opening. Now the Gemara is going to talk about just another example where nifchasa kedelis, not where you made the flap itself, but let's say the piece of the trachea actually was partially cut. Not that you did it to check the holes that were there, but it actually was partially cut, and it formed a flap. So how do you measure? Is the flap a hole or not a hole? Is it an isar or not an isar? It's there but not there. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Nachman Ishi Kanis Isar L'Rachbo. It has to be a little bit larger than an isar. That means if there's an actual hole, an isar is enough. If you have little holes, so then an isar is going to be enough to combine to make an isar. If the flap is still there, so then it has to be a little bit bigger than an isar, the whole part where the flap is, in order to make it a problem. Again, I don't want to oversimplify this stuff. It's obviously very technical and very difficult to understand exactly the metzias without seeing the trachea. It would be difficult to understand even if we saw the trachea. But again, we're just trying to understand the general kolam. Nizdika. Now, this is all talking about, again, a hole in the trachea, or if we're talking about, again, slitting the trachea on rove of the circumference. But what happens if you slit the trachea the other way, lengthwise? This is all widthwise, right? You have the animal that's sitting here, and you're going up, and you're literally cutting it, right? The pipe that's like this, you're cutting it in half. But let's say you don't cut it in half. Let's say you somehow slit it this way. So how much of a perforation or a hole is going to be a problem? Can you slit the entire thing lengthwise and it's still not considered to be a perforation? It says in Gemara, Nizdika mahu. What do we do with Nizdika? So Amarav afilu lo nishtar be'al chulya achas amal chulya achas amatuk share. Again, a little bit hard to understand, but if you look at the picture, there's different chulyas. Chulyas are the bands that surround the trachea over here. So it's like little bands. The equivalent of, each one has like a little thing in between it. So it sounds like if you would, again, the other way we were talking about is you're slitting it from the bottom up. Now we're talking about slitting it across. So if you would slit almost the entire length of the trachea and you just leave a little bit over here, like one band in the beginning and an entire full band at the end, even if you slit the entire thing across, it's going to be okay, which is very interesting. Says the Gemara, I understand. Amra Kamei Rav Yochanan Amar Machuya Machuya de Kamara. What are these bands? Why do you need a whole band in the beginning, a whole band at the end? If slitting it across the length is not really an issue, what do you need to have any bands for? Says the Gemara, Leima Filu Nishtar Bela Amashu Lamala Mashu Lamatak Shera. Amra Kamei Rav Yochanan Mishmei Rav Yonasan Hachi. He said this. Amarlu Yadin Chavin Bivloy Lefrushe Kakiyai Taima. You're right. I don't know what they were talking about. Those rabbis in Bavel. And in a chanami, if you're going to slit it, not necessarily should you, but if you're going to slit it lengthwise, even if you have a little bit, it sounds like you just have to have a little bit holding the entire thing together. If you slit it lengthwise, even if you have a little bit holding the entire thing together, it's going to be okay. We're going to see in just a moment, I think, that it's interesting because if you slit something, let's say in the circumference wide, right, widthwise. So think about what happens when the animal stretches its neck. What happens to that slit that you have? It opens, right? It opens by definition. If you think of like a hose, if you would slit it length, right? If you would slit it, if this is a hose and you're slitting it up most of the way, rove. So when you stretch it, the slit gets bigger, and if anything, it's going to rip. But if you cut it lengthwise, what happens when you pull it? It actually gets tighter and closes it. So that's why it's easy for us to understand why when you go lengthwise, it's going to be a little bit. When you go lengthwise, it's going to be a little bit more makil than if you would go widthwise.
It'll heal.
It'll heal. Right. That's why it's not a treifa. Tana Reb Chia bar Yosef Kamei Rabbi Yochanan. The pictures in there are very, very good. Sometimes they're a little bit harder to understand than a simplified picture in the article, but both of them are very, very good. Tani. We're ready to cut. Yeah. Tana Reb Chia bar Yosef Kamei Rabbi Yochanan. Kol atzavar kulo kosher l'shchita mitabas hagdola ad kanfer ria hatachtona. So we're going back really to Beis Amud Aleph. Really, we're saying where can you cut? From the tabas hagedola, which was the great ring, which was the top of the trachea, we're talking about the trachea now, all the way to the kanfe rea hatachtona. What's that? So if you look over here, the trachea, if this is the animal, really it would be, right, the animal, the trachea is going this way. It goes into, eventually it goes into the lungs. So it enters the lungs here, but it's still open until it actually ends in the lungs. So it sounds like the Gemara is saying you can shech this part until it starts to hit the lungs. Even though this part is exposed and it's already, quote-unquote, in the lungs, that's considered to be part of the lungs at this point, not part of the trachea. Again, it would be pretty hard in Mitzias to get there to be able to shecht it. You have the ribs and everything, but theoretically, if you would shecht the top part, that would be fine. If you would shecht the bottom part, how would you do that? And we're going to discuss in a second. If you would theoretically pull the trachea, how do you pull the trachea? If you pull the neck of the animal, if you overextend the neck of the animal, then the part that's in the lungs now gets pulled out, and you theoretically can go ahead and cut it. So Gemara says that only the top part over there would be okay. The part that's already has entered, not literally entered the lungs, but the part that's like near the beginning of the lungs, that would be an issue. And if you shechted it there, it would not be a good shechita. Amarava tachtona shehil yona. When we say the lower part, kanfei rea hatachtona, the lower lung, it's really the upper lung. What does that mean? Because the lower is the part that's hanging from the legs. That means it's talking about the upper part. So the upper part, because we said akanfei rea hatachtona, we said until the lower lung. Well, we're not really allowed to shecht to the lower lung. We're really shechting to the top of the upper lung, right? It's all one lung. But again, we're shechting up to this part, not to this part. So why do you call it the lower part? Because when you shecht an animal, you go like this and you flip it over, and when it's hanging and you're examining it, you're really saying, well, it can't be cut past here, which is the lower lung, not the upper lung.
So close to the head.
It's not close to the head at all. This is all the way by the lung, I'm saying.
No,
this
but I mean close to the head
part
to the
that's
tail.
closer to the head.
The part that's closer to the head is the tabas hagedola. That's this part.
No,
You
I
can
just meant of the lung, it's the part close.
Oh, yeah. But we're talking about where can you shecht if this is the animal, from tabas hagedola to kanfei rea.
Yeah.
From the top of the tabas hagedola all the way to the beginning of, again, where it starts to enter the lung, even though the lung is actually here, and there's still part of a trachea here. This part of the trachea you cannot cut, because it's already started to enter the lungs, even though it doesn't literally go into the lungs until over there. It's a whole fascinating thing how it works. Amarava. Tachtona shel yona, again, it calls it the lower part, even though it's really the upper part of the lung. It's the closer part to the head, like we're saying. Shani omer kol sheposhet etzavra v'roa. Now, what's this part exactly? How do we figure it out? Whenever the animal extends its neck, whenever it goes at while it's grazing and naturally extends its neck, whatever part, which again the Gemara seems to be saying is this part, whatever part comes and enters into the neck, or at least, goes forward, that's going to be kosher to go ahead and to cut. As long as it's not forced. That means, again, it sounds like if you would pull an animal's neck, then even this part, which is quote-unquote in the beginning of the lungs, even that would come out.
But some would
it would be raised. Some of it would still stay connected to the lung, but it would sort of be pulled. So it's saying that's not okay. Only the part that naturally goes, even when an animal extends its neck, only this part, which will naturally go, that's the part. But if you're going to forcibly, or the part that's only going to come out when you forcibly pull it, i.e. the bottom part, that's not going to be a place that's kosher for shechita. Let's say when the animal, like I said, when I went to the shechita house last week, so it wasn't under any type of duress. Like it didn't know what was happening. But let's say it found out that it was under duress, and it starts really pulling its neck, the equivalent of like if a person would pull the neck. So then how do you count that? Do you count it or not? Says Gemara, Mahu. What about the part of the animal that only would go into the neck if it really pulled it tight? Says Gemara, take you. But again, for our purposes, if you shecht up to this part, it's kosher. If you shecht the part that's already entered the lung a little bit, it's going to be a problem. Says the Gemara, Yosef, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Nafak Milsa min Benayu, they were discussing, Anas b'siman v'shach psula. If you force, again, part of the pipes out of the chest into the neck, i.e. seemingly this part over here that's already partly in the lungs, says a Gemara, that's going to be possible. And if the trachea is punctured below that point, then it's going to be like a puncture of the lung. Again, we're discussing this part right here. So how do you consider that? Well, you can consider it part of the trachea. If it's part of the trachea, then it's kasher v'shchita, and then it has halachas of trachea when it comes to puncturing. If it's part of the lung, then it's not part of the trachea, then it's not kasher for shechita, then it's part of the lung. So we're saying this part over here is actually part of the lung, therefore it's not kasher if you do shechita on that part, and also if there's a puncture, even a tiny puncture, like it would ruin a lung, is going to ruin it as well. Tana Reb Chia bar Yosef kamei de Rabbi Yochanan. Back. Tana Rabbanan. Ezehu chazeh. So we know that by a shlamim, the meat goes to the owner. It's eaten by anybody tahor in Yerushalayim, but the chazeh, the shok and the chazeh, the breast and the right thigh, need to be given to a kohen, and then they or people in their house can eat it. So where's the chazeh? Zeharoas hakarka. It's this part. It's the bottom of the animal which sees the karka, Limata ada savar, downward to the neck, like this. Limala ada keres, up to the pouch. So it's this part, the bottom part. Again, you'd have to like cut it out from underneath the ribs, but this would be the part of the breast that we're talking about giving to the Kohen. And again, this was halacha l'maisa. This was actually stuff that they would take off from the animal and give to the Kohen. Says Gemara, Nikav krum shel moach. The membrane of the brain was actually punctured. Then it's a treifa as well. Now, the brain has a lot of parts. And again, a lot of similarities with the human brain. There's a skull. Then there's a outer membrane. Then there's a thin inner membrane. And then there's the actual brain. So as we'll see in a second, the Gemara is going to compare it to beitzim, which you could either say testicles or you could say actual beitzim. So if you want to compare it to a beitza, an actual egg, you can imagine that you have the skull of the egg, which is, I'm just trying to think, there is no real thing here, but the skull of the egg would be non-existent in a beitza. You have the skull. Then the shell of the egg would be the outer membrane. The white part would be the inner membrane, for argument's sake. And then the yellow would be the actual brain. Again, it's not exactly like that because the inner membrane is a very, very thin piece. It would be like the white part on the white of the egg. There's a little sometimes there's like a very thin white part, the filling, and then the actual white part, the white, forget about the yellow, the white would be the brain. So you'd have like the white part being the brain, you'd have the very thin filling being the inner membrane, you have the shell being the outer membrane, and the entire thing would be inside of a skull. So where is it a problem? Rav Shmuel Damri Tavayu Karma Ilah Afagav Delo Inkav Tata. That means if the outer harder membrane of the brain, besides for the skull, it means it got into the skull and then into the outer membrane. If it got into the outer membrane and then now it's punctured, it's going to be a problem even if the inner membrane is not punctured, because by definition, if the outer membrane is punctured, since the inner one is so skinny, is so thin, it's going to be punctured right away as well. For Amrila, others say ad inka of tata. No, Lamai said both of the membranes, even the thin one, must be punctured in order to be a problem. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Nachmane v'simanach chaysa demidnach beimocha. The pouch in which the brain is going to be a problem. Again, similar to beitzim, you could either explain that as the testicles of the animal, or as I explained, as the egg of the animal. But again, there's a machlokas by the brain, if there's a puncture, whether it's just the outer membrane is enough to make it a treifa, or it has to even go to the inner membrane. It's not going to be that much of a difference, but at the end of the day, that would still be the nafkamina.
How would they ever, why would they actually, in other words, if the brain is punctured and it becomes a treifa, when would that ever come out?
After they shech the animal, they'd have to check it.
So do they do that?
We don't necessarily. Again, I was asking because we just check the lungs, but seemingly, again, I think we're basing
trouble, right?
If
you don't look inside the brain,
this is not like
access. What's the big deal?
I think that we're doing based on a treifa. I think we're doing it based on a chazaka nowadays. Right. But at the end of the day, seemingly you really have to check the brain as well. It's not, Rabbi. It's not a din that you're looking for problems. It's that if you want to know whether something was a treifa, whether it was going to live for a year or not. So you might not see it, but at the end of the day, if it had a hole in its brain for whatever reason, then by definition, it wasn't going to live a year, depending on where the hole is.
Maybe there's an injury. The head has been injured.
That's what I'm saying. But the point is that Lamaisa, that's a little bit different. But the point is that Lamaisa today, they're not going ahead and checking every single piece of every single cow, which really, according to what we're learning, they should. They should be checking the entire trachea.
An autopsy of every animal would be insane.
Right. Correct. But again, if you want to,
It's already
right.
But the skull's even harder. You have to saw it open.
Right. Okay, Lamaisa, you're right. I've been telling you since the beginning of the Masechta, you shouldn't be eating any meat. You should be a vegetarian. Says the Gemara. Chazal Baruch. Why vegan? Why?
Drinking milk. How about drinking milk?
Okay, milk is also a problem. You're right. I told you that there are certain rabbis who don't drink milk because they don't trust the chazak. I don't know why they eat meat. I have to ask them. I'm curious, but they don't drink milk because the chazak is based on there aren't enough. It's not that you don't check it. You don't check the cow for milk until afterwards.
Milk is almost worse.
Milk is sometimes worse because you're not checking it at all. Right. Milk is horrible. Yes. Okay. Says the Gemara.
Almond milk.
Not from. What's the problem with the milk?
The milk is that you're milking an animal that you haven't checked for. You never check the animal. Meat that you ate. Meat that you eat, you shecht it, and at least you're checking the lungs afterwards. Here, you can't have the milk from an animal that's a treifa, or an animal that, especially if you're going to just go based on the lungs, an animal that has adhesions in the lungs. And if we're saying that 28% or 30% of animals, again, I have to figure out the Matthias, but the way that they explain is that 30% of kosher animals or 40% of animals that you shecht and you check are not really kosher, or 30% are kosher, let's say the numbers are, that means 70% of the kosher animals are not kosher. And then what do you do?
So what we're saying, Chalav Yisrael is a joke.
Chalav Yisrael is Chalav Yisrael is a totally different thing. Chalav Yisrael is that there's a person milk. Chalav Yisrael is based on.
It doesn't help this situation.
Chalav Yisrael is based on milking it so that there's no pig getting mixed in. That
doesn't help the situation.
No, but the Chalav Yisrael doesn't negate the fact that it could be.
No, of course, that has nothing to do with Chalav Yisrael.
Now I understand that
Correct.
Glatt Kosher Dairy Restaurant.
Glatt Kosher Dairy Restaurant. Correct.
Check out the
They check out the cow afterwards. That's gonna be very expensive. Every time you milk a cow, you're gonna milk the cow and then you're gonna chef it afterwards. It's gonna be very expensive.
That explains the being Glatt Kosher.
Maybe
Yeah.
there'll be an MRIs on cows so you can check the lungs.
No, again, so it's very interesting, but you bring up very, very interesting points over here. Okay, so now we can't eat meat.
I think we've
we can't
milked this
drink
for all
milk.
it's worth, right?
We can't do anything. We're basically, yeah. You can't eat vegetables because there's bugs.
You can have oath. You can have the oath.
Okay, you
Go
can
for
have.
potato chips.
Let's go. We got to learn. We got to learn a little bit. Says the Gemara. Now we're going to talk about the brain to the spinal cord. So you go from the brain all the way to the spinal cord. So where does the brain start for those trephas? And where does the brain end? And then what's the spinal cord? And where does the spinal cord start and end? You have the running along the entire animal. The spinal cord goes all the way, as we'll see, to the back, all the way to the tail. There's branches of nerves. So where does the brain start and end? And where does the spinal cord? There's a very good picture by the brain over here as well on the next page. It says, Rabbi Yeshua, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Mishum bar Kapara. Moach kol ma shebegdera nidon kemoach. Whatever is in the cranium, i.e. the skull, is the brain. Where the brain begins to go outside of the skull, that's the spinal cord. Where does it go out? Like two beans, Minapolim vilifnim kilifnim. From the two beans inward is the brain. Minapolim lachutz kilachutz. Upolanatzman eni yodea umistaber kilifnim. The two beans themselves I consider to be seemingly like the brain. So what are we talking about here? Look at the top. This is the animal from the top. This is a view of the top of the animal. This is the front. This is the back. You have the brain here. You have a little area here where you have two beans, equivalent of two beans, and you have the veshet and the kana that are literally running. Right to where the there's a little thing called the chud hashedra, the spinal cord right here, which connects to the brain. So the question: this is definitely the brain. This is definitely not the brain. This is definitely the spine. The question is this area, this small area in between the two, what they're calling the occipital condyles.
Occipital is a positioning.
So these two things here we're discussing. So he wants the cheshbon. What happens if there's, and it's very possible, what happens if there's a thing here? So if there's a hole here, a puncture here, or in one of the pollen, then we would consider it to be part of the brain. And this part, after the two things are done, that would be considered to be part of the spine. Says the Gemara, Nikav halev lebeis chalalo. Again, it would be a little bit different. The picture in there, I think it's a little different when it's a bird. Says the Gemara, Nikav halev lebeis chalalo. If you have the heart that's punctured in the chamber. So we know that the heart, as you see over here from the cutaway view, there's two chambers. There's the aorta here, which goes into the heart, and then you have the large chamber and the small chamber, the left ventricle and the other ventricle, the right ventricle. So the question is, where exactly, what? Ventricle, I'm sorry, ventricle. The right and left ventricle.
It's an N, ventricle.
Ventricle. I stopped at 5th grade science, so I'm Boy Rabbi Zera. Lebeis chalal katan, lebeis chalal gadol. This is why you have to go to university. If you want to be able to learn CHULLIN. You got to go to university over here. Rabbi Zera asks, when we're talking about a puncture in the chamber, is it the small chamber or specifically the large chamber? That means, is it even the small chamber that's going to be a problem, or only if there's a puncture in the main large chamber, the left ventricle of the heart? Amalei Abaye Maiti Boilach. Abaye says to Rabbi Zera, what's your question? Milotanan, we saw elsewhere by the lungs, that we know that by the lungs, if you look over here, you have the bronchi, the symphonos, you have the primary bronchi in the middle, and we're going to talk about punctures in the different bronchi over here. So the Gemara says, what's the halacha by a lung? Rabbi Shimon Omer Achatinake lebeis hasymphonos. We'll see that it's in the plural. That it's only a problem, it's only a treifa if the hole penetrates to the bronchi in plural. What does this mean? Achatinake litzimphon gadol. It's only a problem if it penetrates one of the primary main bronchi over here, not one of the bronchi on the side. So just like you're going to say by the lungs, it has to be a primary bronchi that has a penetration in it, and then has a perforation, has a hole in it. So too, seemingly, it would have to be the main. It would have to be the main part of the heart, the main chamber of the heart that has a hole in it. Says Imar Hachiashta, you can't compare the two. Hasam lebeis hasymphonos ketani. When you're dealing with the primary bronchi, the chamber of the bronchi, you're dealing with plural. Why? Lehecha deshavche symphonos kule. Because there's a lot of different bronchi over here, which are all coming to a central location. So if they're all running to a central location, then it's only going to be that central location that has a hole. That's going to be a problem. But over here, where we're talking in the singular, where you have two separate entities, two separate beis chalalim, two separate chambers, so then either one of them that has a hole is going to be a problem. Hacham lebeis chalalo ketani. It's the chamber, the singular chamber. Mali chalal gadol, mali chalal katam. Why should it make a difference? If there's a hole in either chamber, it's going to be a problem. Kinei halev, the pipe of the heart. And we're going to talk about right now, what we're going to explain in just a second. If you look here, here's the heart, and here are the lungs that are surrounding the heart. And here's the veshet, the kana and the veshet, the esophagus and the trachea. Here's the lung again. Right outside, which really this picture here, the aorta runs into the heart, but the aorta seems to run through the lungs. It's like partly through the lungs, and then it runs into the heart, which is behind the lungs, based on the picture. So we're talking about this part over here, which is the aorta, which is covered in fat. So the Gemara says, Kinei halev, this aorta, the pipe of the heart, Rav Amar b'mashu, how much of a perforation is going to be a problem? Or how much of a puncture? So Rav Amar says even a slight puncture in the aorta. Shmuel Amar beruvo. Shmuel says that's to be only if you cut most of the aorta. Now again, we're not talking about cutting, we're talking about when you open up the animal, you see that it had a cut in most of the aorta, it's going to be a problem. You say, no, even if it had a puncture, it wasn't going to live a year. He says, no, unless most of the aorta is cut, it would have lived for a year. And again, this is it's not so crazy. It's like you open up a human being, and you look at it, so how much of the heart was actually blocked? Person didn't have a heart attack. A person just dies of natural causes. So you can look and you can see how much, based on the amount of blockage in the heart, you could have said, you know, well, this person would have had a heart attack in the next 3 months, or the person would have lived for another 100 years. So it's the same idea. When you're looking at the heart after, you're looking at the aorta after the animal dies, or after it was shachted. Hi niu knele, what's this pipe of the heart? Like I mentioned, Amar Bar Yitzchak, Amar Rav, chaylev shal gabi defana. So it's the fat on the walls. Now, until in a second, we're going to say that it's the aorta, but originally it's going to say maybe it's some other fat. Defano sal kadaitach. What do you mean? Shal gabi do ella shal gabi dofnei rea. Again, it's on the walls of the lungs, which is the aorta, which is the fat that runs between the two lungs, like I mentioned, into the heart. Says Gemara, Amar Meimar Mishmei de Rav Nachman. Tlasa kanehavu. There are actually 3 pipes that come from the trachea. And you can see based on the picture as well. There are 3 pipes. Chad parish liba, 1 to the heart. Chad parish lirea, 1 to the lungs. Chad parish lekabda, 1 to the liver. Derea karea, the part of the lung is treated like the lung itself. That means the trachea, the part of the trachea that goes to the lung is treated like the lung in terms of having a puncture. Dekabda kikabda, the part of the liver is, the one that goes to the liver is like the liver itself. It's not treifa until even the slightest puncture, but it's not treifa until it's completely removed. Deliba pligian, like we're saying here, this pipe, the aorta, there's a machlokas if it's a small puncture or the entire circumference. Mar bachir masne ipcha, derea kikavna, dekabda karea, deliba peligi. Same thing you see that the heart they're arguing about. I don't understand this opinion, why the pipe that's running into the lung is treated like the liver. I'm not exactly sure why that would be, and the one that's running into the liver will be treated like the lung, but the point is that both of them agree that Rav and Shmuel argue about a hole in the aorta. Azar Rav Chia Bar Yosef, Amar l'shmaita de Rav kamei de Shmuel. He said it in front of Shmuel, and Shmuel said, Amar le, hachi Amar Abba lo yada b'treifos v'lo klum. I guess Shmuel had not heard what Rav says, and Rav had said that even a small puncture in the knei alev, even a small puncture in the aorta is going to be a problem. And Shmuel said, Rav, I'm not sure that you know anything about treifos. Okay, Nishbar Hashidra. I'm saying to him in a very loving way. If the spine was broken and the spinal cord was cut, then it's a treifa. Ton Rabbanan. Chod Hashidra shenifsak berubo. If the spinal cord was severed, berubo diver Rabbi Yaakov Amar filu nikav. So Rabbi Yaakov is more machmer, and he says even if there's a small puncture, hora Rabbi Rabbi Yaakov. But Rabbi, even though he felt that in order for the spinal cord to be a problem, it has to be cut berubo, he paskined, when he paskined like Rabbi, he paskined like Rabbi Yaakov and said that even a small puncture in the spinal cord is going to be a problem. Amar Rafuna ain't halach like Rabbi Yaakov, even though Rabbi paskined like him, halach is not like Rabbi Yaakov, and really in order for the spinal cord to be a problem, it needs to have a rove. It can't just be merely punctured, it has to have rove severed. Says Gemara V'kam how much is rove? If you're talking about the spinal cord, Rav Amar rove oro, V'amrila rove mocho. Again, a little bit hard to understand the metzias, but it looks like over here there's nerve tissue in the spinal cord, and then there are meninges, which are like the skin on top of the spinal cord. So we're talking about which one has to have a puncture, or which one does rove have to have come off. Does rove of the nerve tissue have to be cut, or does rove of the skin that's protecting the nerve tissue have to be cut? So the Gemara says there's a machlokes. Mandamar of mocho koshkein ravo, or the one who says that a majority of the nerve tissue is going to be a problem would agree that if the majority of the skin is cut, it's going to be a problem, because once the majority of the skin is cut, then by definition the majority of the nerve tissue is going to be cut, because the skin is protecting the nerve tissue. The meninges is protecting the nerve tissue. According to the one who says that no, if the majority of the skin, so is it just the majority of the skin or even the majority of the nerve tissue? Tashma de Amar Nivli Amar Afuna, Ruba Shamar Rov Oro, Moach Zel Lomalav Lomar. According to this opinion, it's dafka if most of the skin, most of the meninges is severed, but if the most of the nerve tissue, we don't really care about the nerve tissue. It sounds like even if the nerve tissue is severed, somehow it's amazing. It sounds like it, but it sounds like if most of the nerve tissue is severed, the animal can still live, which is very, very interesting. Says the Gemara of Nasan bar Avin Havi Yosef Kamei Derav Badak Barov Ora V'Kabadik Barov Mocho Amar Lei Im Rov Ora Kaya Moach Zeh Eino Moa Level Eino Bar. Why are you checking the nerve tissue? Even if the nerve tissue is totally severed, it's not going to be a problem. Amar Baruch Barchana Amar Yeshua ben Levi Nismarech Pasol Nismasmeis Pasol. That if the nerve tissue or the spinal cord, it's interesting, even if it's severed, it's not going to be a problem. Even if you hold it's not a problem when it's severed, if it's liquefied or softened, it's a problem. Ezu hamrachav, ezu hamasmasa. What does it mean that the nerve tissue is liquefied? What does it mean that it's softened? Hamracha, liquefied means kol shenishbach keketon, that the nerve tissue literally will pour like water, which means that if you have a little puncture, if you put a little puncture in the skin, the entire thing's just going to leak out. Masmasa kol sheinu yachol la'amod, and softening, which is more machmir, is saying that even if it's not going to leak out like a water, even if it's just softened to the point that if you would hold the spinal cord upright, the whole thing would like bend over. That's also going to be a problem. Let's say it's going to bend over not because it's so soft, because it's so heavy, right? It weighs so much. The animal was fat. Says Gemara Teku. We don't know exactly what the halacha would be. Bei Rav Amrei nismasmeis pasol. If it's soft and it's pasul, nismazmeis. This is something else that's kosher. Nismazmeis, different Rishonim explain differently. The easiest to understand is that it got a concussion. If it got a concussion as a result of a fall, it's going to be kosher because it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to die. We know, like human beings, if they get concussions, not going to die within a year. Baruch Hashem. But it sounds like if you have the nerve tissue, if the moach becomes concussed, so then it's going to be a problem. Says Gemara, he nismasmeis. No, it's not nismasmeis, it's nismasmeis. No, if it becomes soft, then it's a problem, but if it becomes concussed, it's not a problem. Indi, is that true? Levi was sitting in the bathhouse. Some man smashed his head into the wall. Okay? So instead of calling Hatzalah, he said, come here, I want to examine you. Amar nismazmeis moche dedain. Says, let me check you out. He checks it out and says, well, this guy got a concussion. What does that mean? It's lost his substance. He's a treifa. Lav de lochai. What did he mean that he's lost his substance? What does that mean? It sounds like he's not going to survive. So you just told me that if you have a concussion of the nerve tissue, you're going to survive. It's not a treifa. This guy, he looks at him and says, Lamaisi, you just banged your head on the wall. Lamaisi, you're going to die. No, we're not going to bother. Amar Abaye lo mar she'eno molid. No, the guy got a concussion. He's not going to die. He's going to become sterile. Very, very interesting. So again, because of this concussion, this serious concussion that he had, he was going to become sterile. And again, I would be very curious to see halacha l'maisa, not halacha l'maisa, but to see in mitzias, is that true that a person can injure their brain to the extent where they become sterile as a result of it? But again, it doesn't mean that it's by definition going to die, and therefore it's not a contradiction. Okay, now we went to the upper limit of the spinal cord. We went to the brain, and we said it starts, and in between the two beans, it's still considered to be part of the brain. And now, how far back does it go? Just want to show you this picture before we go further. We went from here. Now we're following the spinal cord all the way to the back, and then it starts. You have the ribs here. Obviously, there's nerves all along, but there's some main, what it's calling branches that branch out from the back. So the question is, if we're talking about the spinal cord having a puncture, do these green things, which are branches, they're not literally green, but do these branches, which then go into the different parts of the body, into the legs, and then all the way to the Gid HaNasha, the sciatic nerve. So are these green things also going to be considered part of the spinal cord in terms of making it a treifa, that it has a puncture in it? Or once you get to those branches, you're out of the spinal cord, and if any of those get a hole in them, it's not going to be the end of the world. Says the Gemara, at Heichan Chut HaShidra. So where does the spinal cord go until? It goes all the way to the tail, but how far back is it going to be an issue? Until, again, between the branches. Like I mentioned, until like where he has the green over here between the branches, so that's going to be a problem. The Gemara is going to ask what between the branches are. But at the end of the point, at that point between the branches, that's when it's no longer going to be a treifa if it has a hole. Rav Dimi bar Yitzchak have a kabay lemezal lebei chozai. So it's interesting. Rav Dimi bar Yitzchak was going on a trip. So the rabbi's leaving his house, and as he's leaving, knocked on the door. Asa lekame de Rav Yehuda. Well, I'm really in a rush. Well, I just have a quick question, but I'm in a rush. I'm in a quick question. Okay, just ask me the question. Amar le lichave limar ben haprashos hecha. Can you show me on an animal where the ben haprashos is, so that I'll know that if there's a puncture there, it's not a problem? Amar le, sure, I have plenty of time. Zil aisili gedi v'achavei. Go get me a gedi. Go get me a kid, and I'll show you to you. Aisile gedi shmeina. So we got him a fat kid that had already been slaughtered and skinned, and he showed it to him. Amar le, okay, can you show me now? Blia tfei v'lo yadia. Sorry, this one's a little bit too fat, and therefore I can't dissect it even further because I got to run. But it's too fat for me to show. Usually when you would skin it and you would shacht it, so you'd be able to see where the branches are going until, and you'd be able to show you this is where the branches end. But he couldn't do it because this animal was too fat. So he said, Aisile kachush. He brought him a leaner one that didn't have so much fat, so he'd be able to see it. Amar le, this one's too lean. Blitan tfei v'lo yadia. The hip bones are coming out too much because it's too skinny, and therefore I can't see it either. So he says, okay, you got to go. Amar le ta'ag marach gemara. So at least instead of giving me a visual demonstration, in the meantime, give me an oral demonstration. Just tell me based on explanation where exactly this point is. Hachar Shmuel. So he says this is what Shmuel said. Ad achas treifa, that from the neck until the first section between the branches, that's going to be a treifa. That's going to be considered part of the spinal cord. Shlish is kshera. From the third section, that's going to be kosher. Sheni eini yodea. The second section, I'm not 100% sure. Boy, Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua. So Rav Huna Breder Yoshua is going to ask a bunch of questions. Advad Bechlal, Dim Advad Bechlal. He's going to continue, and he's going to get into the whole discussion here. But again, we're discussing these branches here. Definitely the part closer to the spine is like the spine. The part closer to the tail is not like the spine. The part in the middle is unclear whether it's going to be a problem or not.